Whereabouts are you located?
I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Where are you?
I live in Toronto, but I'm at a cabin on a lake about 3 hours north. Enjoying the summer.
Is that where you're from originally, Canada?
Yeah,
Oh, okay. Yeah, it
yeah,
sounds like based on the books that you've kind of traveled around the world though a little bit, right?
yeah. I do a lot of traveling for sure.
Yeah. And so from your travels, I've heard you say that Italy and Japan have the best food.
I would say, I mean, if you had to pick, yes, South Korea's also got very good food, but Italy and Japan, if you had to kind of pick one country to spend the rest of your life eating in, it would be one of those two.
And they have thin people too, which is crazy.
It is, yeah, it really is. Or maybe we're crazy and they're not.
Yeah, my brother went to Japan and I mean, he was just sending me pictures how clean the streets were. And then, yeah, he was showing me the food and they had this it was like some sort of chicken strips or something. But again, people are thin and they're eating, how can they eat chicken strips? I don't know. It's interesting.
It's weird. You go to 7-Eleven and they have like a tonkatsu, which is like a deep fried pork cutlet. And it's really interesting. But the quality is really high, is the major difference. They have fried food, but when they have fried food, it's never dripping in grease. It's perfectly crispy. Like their standards of execution are just at the very top.
So do you think that we could potentially still eat some fried foods and not have heart disease and obesity and all these other
Oh,
issues
for
that,
sure. I think it's just a question of how much. I don't, when people say this food is healthy and this food is unhealthy, it doesn't make sense to me. Like apples are healthy. Like you can't live on apples. You die. If all you ate are apples, you die. So it's always a question of proportion. It's always the dose that makes the poison. And it's always a question of how much or how little makes something good or unhealthy. People say chocolate chip cookies are unhealthy. If you have one a week, it's not going to kill you or, or more, but it's people who eat an entire bag or half a bag after dinner. That's the problem.
and according to the books, I mean, this is kind of what you're talking about, is that it's the way they've designed them. They've kind of hijacked our flavor systems to make it. I mean, is this not just like a drug at this point? Like some of these foods are like, I mean, people are addicted to them. They're causing them health issues. I mean, isn't it in some ways it's worse than some of the drugs people are on?
It's, the question of addiction is a tricky one because I always say it involves similar brain systems. It involves the reward system. One thing that, disordered eating has in common with drug addiction is just desire, craving, characterizes both. They have a desire to do things that they know they shouldn't do. They know on some level can be ruining their lives, especially drug addicts. But there's also a difference though, in that something like full-blown cocaine or heroin addiction is a very severe, not only life destroying, but family destroying addiction. Whereas when we talk about us, people say, cheeseburgers are addictive and so forth. There is that compulsive element, but it can be kind of discourteous to people struggling with real true addiction to say it's the same thing. There are similarities, but there are differences as well.
Well, what if we compared it to cigarettes? Because I think isn't there, and I can't remember if you talked about this in your book or if I read this somewhere else, but wasn't there a thing that a lot of the people that worked at the tobacco industry, once cigarettes kind of got banned, not banned, but they were so discouraged and the sales were so down that those people went and worked for these big food companies and took the same principles of addiction, getting people hooked on cigarettes to get them hooked on food.
No, I didn't write that. I honestly don't know how true that is because I don't think the food companies know what they're doing. I've talked to a lot of them. I think they've gotten lucky a whole bunch of times. But the graveyard of failed products is way, way
Really?
larger than the arena of successful products. Yeah, they would love to be able to come up with the next Doritos or something like that. It's really not easy. I think
Hmm.
they also don't put nearly as much resources into scientifically understanding what they're doing. They just throw stuff at the wall and waits to see what sticks.
Hmm.
And it's up to the scientists to try and figure out why. But I think there's a lot in this conversation we get wrong. There's this whole idea that these foods kind of reach multiple bliss points and that we're overwhelmed by pleasure. And I think that gets it completely wrong. And I think we all know that because we call these things junk food, Big Macs, Doritos, potato chips. We all eat them and we all know what it's like. But you'd never say that, the best meal I ever had was a bag of chips and then a Big Mac or something. No one says that. Maybe some people, but um, And we call it junk food because we know on some level it's not real. Like when do you use the term junk? You'd say something like, well, I bought a used car and it turned out to be a piece of junk. What does that mean? It means I thought it was something that it was not. And I think that's what characterizes so many of these foods, is that they're kind of pretending to be food. And that's where the food technology gets into it. That's where the flavor technology gets into it. But when we tell ourselves that we're being overwhelmed by pleasure, I don't think that's true, because, if you and I were to, like, let's say, go on like a buddy adventure and go eating, we'd go to Italy or Japan or something. We wouldn't go to McDonald's. We'd maybe go to Spain, or we'd go to Greece and have like grilled fish or something, or go visit a winery, or go to Belgium and eat chocolate or something. So I think it's important to be clear about exactly how this food is working, because I don't think our problem is like our food is just way too delicious. It's way too compulsive. There's something about it that makes you eat it, but it's not the most ragingly, outstandingly delicious food there is. I don't think it comes even close to that.
So then what is it? Why are we, because you do get these cravings, and especially like it's different. I noticed, like, because I was doing this like program where I was like, okay, I'm going to stick to this diet and there was no cheat meals. I was part of the program. So I was like, okay, so I got out of this habit, and so I feel like I didn't crave it as much. But when I go, you know what? It's been a long year. It's the holidays. I'm just going to take a week off of dieting. And then you eat like one junk food meal and then you start craving. And especially if you just give yourself no limits, you're like, I'm going to get fast food like every meal. It's I don't know, some weird phenomenon.
It is a weird phenomenon. I also notice I don't eat a lot of junk food, but sometimes you're trapped in an airport and you literally have no choice and you're starving because, you got up at 6 a.m. and you're making your second connection. You got to eat. And the thing I always marvel at is how fast the food goes down. And you're like, I could, I just ate like 1,300 calories. It took 3 minutes and I feel like I haven't eaten anything and I want to eat it again, even though I didn't like it. It's a very strange experience. And there is something compulsive to it. The guy who invented the term bliss point, his name's Howard Moskowitz. And I talked to him about it. He regrets using that term because all it means is like the most preferred point. Like when you talk about the sugar bliss point, let's say you're inventing cherry Dr. Pepper, it just means the amount of sugar that people like best. A little bit less, people don't like it as much. A little bit more, it's too sweet. But what he also told me is that when the food companies would talk to him about designing foods, this is in the 80s and 90s, they didn't use terms like bliss. They were after things like craveability. A term they used was moreish. So they were after foods that made you want to take the next bite. And I think that's really important because I think there's kind of different impulses inside our appetite. And I think one thing that's a bit of a dead giveaway is the language. When you look at the landscape of fast food, look at the words they use. There's the Big Mac or the Quarter Pounder, the Whopper, the Triple Stacker. These are all promises of like big calories. So they're aimed at people who are kind of on the hunt for big calories. If you go to a restaurant, let's say more fancy, I don't like to get into the food, like a lot of it can sound like food snobbery, and I hate that. But when restaurants are talking about the ingredients that they use, it's not this promise of like some walloping load of calories. It's more like we're going to dazzle your senses. We're going to take you on a journey. And I think the term delicious has more than one meaning. You can say, for example, it's rare, but we've all had really good strawberries. They're amazing. They're wonderful. We say they're delicious, but they're delicious in a different way than like a Big Mac or a slice of mediocre pizza. Some foods I find they make you want to take the next bite. So the experience is like, I want the next one. It's kind of, it's aroused. It's, you're after something. And other foods are more immersive and you sit back and the food kind of takes control. And we have this one word that describes two very different experiences. And I think that's kind of a clue. I mean, you're right. These foods do get us into this kind of compulsive bad habits. But when we get away from them, then these other habits take hold where you get really interested in eating good food. And you want to, I wrote a book about steak. I want to eat the best steak. I love great fruit. I want to eat really good fruit. I sometimes, it's really interesting how wonderful really good food can be. And we see that in cultures, talking about Italy and Japan. I think those are the two best examples of cultures that are motivated by really good food. And the food's incredible and the people are thin. So I think that's a big clue. That's telling us something really important as to which of these impulses we should be, gearing ourselves towards.
Yeah, well, and I also think it's which I think you did talk about this in your book about just, and like you're in that Food Incorporated too, which those are both Food Incorporated 1 and 2 are both great documentaries on this whole subject of how we've kind of changed the landscape of food. But like, there's a guy at my gym, one of the guys who works there who trains me, and he's from Romania, and he said that in Romania, like he goes into it, like you get an apple from like your yard, like there'll be an apple tree in the yard. He said you taste the apple and it's like delicious. It's amazing. He's like, you taste an apple here and it's like, doesn't taste the same. And I found that so fascinating because you just don't hear a lot about the differences, or you hear that it's like that's just a conspiracy. Like people say that they're gluten intolerant and then they go to Europe and they can eat the bread there. But you look at the ingredients and it is less ingredients. So I think like other countries are doing things differently, right? But then now we're imposing these kinds of manufacturing ways in other countries, and now they're getting fat.
Yeah, so you're right. There are a lot of differences, and that's a good one. People seem to be able to eat foods in Europe that they can't eat here, and this is something I got really interested in. Italy was the most interesting thing to me, and this kind of took me on an interesting journey. And Northern Italy in particular is really interesting because if you go, I mean, all of Italy is great to eat in. Every single region. There's even regions that are not in Italy, like Croatia. They say where are the best parts. What are the best places to eat in Croatia? Where there's Italian speaking Croatians, basically. I don't know what it's something with the language. Just organize your brain to want to eat good food or something. It's obviously not that simple, but all of Italy is wonderful. But the city of Bologna seems to have a particular obsession with food. They have in the Chamber of Commerce, they have this repository of official recipes of their most famous dishes, things like their lasagna or tortellini, or their famous ragu alla bolognese. And they have an official recipe. They can say, if you're going to make it, this is the official way to make it. Now, of course, all the locals argue. It was like, well, that recipe's close, but my grandmother says you need to add a little bit of this or something like that. But they all take this question of recipes so seriously that they've kind of codified it. And their favorite noodle is called a tagliatella. Tagliatella is the plural. And they have a version cast in gold. It's like the perfect noodle. The food there is extraordinary. I mean, it's and people come there literally by the plane load. Every day plane loads of people unload so they can just go and eat as the locals eat. So you'd think if that delicious food equaled obesity, you would think that the Northern Italians would be the fattest in the world because they're, by our standards of measurement, like things like tourism dollars devoted to food, they're number one. And yet they're the thinnest. The obesity rate is less than 10%. So you're like, what is going on? Sorry, not my dog.
No, I've heard that too. Well, what is one piece of the puzzle that Europeans and Italians that they walk a lot? I've heard that's a big thing too, that walking in Europe is huge. People walk everywhere. Or certainly drive cars.
No, you're right. And I wonder about that. Now, a lot of, physiologists will say, well, there's no way they walk enough to burn off the calories. Like they're consuming fewer calories for sure. I also wonder, and these things are hard to test, does somehow walking a lot kind of tell your brain to be slim because, you're going to have to climb all sorts of flights of stairs and so forth. But I got really curious about Northern Italy and I thought, what's the difference? And I started to look back historically, and what shocked me actually was that at one time, Northern Italy and the United States were actually very similar. And the similarity was the south of the United States and the north of Italy. And this is going back a little over a century. They were both racked by this disease, an epidemic, a mysterious epidemic called Pellagra. The word comes from an Italian dialect, which means rough skin. And that's how it started. It would usually start with like farmers, and they get these skin scales in the spring. Then it would kind of go away, but then it would come back. And at its worst, it would lead to dementia, diarrhea, and eventually death. And kind of similar to, our obesity problem, everyone had a theory. Some people thought it was caused by mosquitoes. Some people said, no, it's sandflies. There was like the insect contingent. There were some people that said it had to do with if you lived too close or too far away from a river. It was bizarre, the number of theories they had. And finally, the guy who figured it out was they sent an epidemiologist, Joseph Goldberger, to a sanatorium in Georgia. Pellagra started in Italy, but then it sprang up in the States. And he started doing all sorts of strange things. He said, don't clean up the vomit in the hallway. Don't change the sheets. But let's feed them peas and milk for dinner. And people thought he was nuts, but he managed to cure it. And what he realized is that it was a diet problem, that there was something in their food that they weren't getting. And this was a seminal moment in the history of nutrition because it led to the discovery of vitamin B3, niacin, but also vitamin theory, essential nutrient theory, which is that there are essential elements in food that are necessary to live. We call them vitamins, minerals. These are the micronutrients, as opposed to the macronutrients, the energy, protein, fat, carbs. But what's even more interesting is how the two cultures dealt with it. What happened in America was a bringing together of cutting-edge science and public policy, a marriage that was incredibly successful. What happened in America was that the government mandated the addition not just of niacin, but two other B vitamins, riboflavin and thiamine, first to bread flour, and then it was in bread, and then pasta, and then rice, and it just sort of moved through all the, most of the processed carbs. And we still have it today. We call it enrichment. And it was stunningly successful. I mean, overnight, Pellagra just poof, gone. What's even more curious is what the Italians did, because you'd think, well, they knew what the Americans knew. They knew it was niacin. They knew you could add niacin to flour, pasta. They love their pasta. Why didn't they do that? They didn't do anything of the sort. It was kind of like medieval what they did. They said poor people should raise rabbits because rabbits are a cheap form of meat. They said we should, there could be communal bread ovens. They said people with pellagra should drink a glass of wine, which you're just like, it seems ridiculous. It actually wasn't bad advice. They didn't know it at the time, but their wines back then weren't very well filtered. They had lots of yeast, and yeast actually has lots of niacin. So it was actually good advice. Not that they knew why. But what's also interesting about the Italian example is that they ate their way out of a nutritional deficiency. Now, here's where things get really, really interesting. As you fast forward the clock more than a century, and the American South went from being the Pellagra belt to today's the diabetes belt or the obesity belt. So it went from one nutritional disaster to another. Went from not having enough to kind of starving to being fat. And this is, it is sort of typifies what seems to be the existential problem with food, which is that you're either going to starve or you're going to eat yourself to death, because that's the way evolution designed us. There was never enough food, so we were kind of designed to pig out. And the American South seems to just beautifully encapsulate that problem we have with food. But then you go to Italy, and what was their Pellagra belt is now one of the most economically productive parts of Europe, but also has arguably one of the very best relationships with food in the world. They eat incredibly delicious food, and yet they're thin. So that leads to this question of, did enrichment, did this government mandate have something to do with it? And I think what it tells us on the broader level, it's the way two different cultures look at food. America looked at food and they said, okay, well, there's two problems. The first is that we don't know what's good for us. We eat the wrong food and we get sick. And the second problem is that food is imperfect. It doesn't have all the nutrients that we need. So we're going to step in and we're going to use the cold clinical hand of science and the incredible, powerful hand of government intervention. And we're going to sprinkle in these life-saving vitamins. Italy took a completely different approach. They said, food isn't the problem. They said, food's the cure. They said, these people don't have access to good food. Now, by good food, this was just kind of like almost like a peasant sense of what's wholesome and good to eat. It wasn't about vitamins and minerals and protein. And yet their approach in the long term seems to be far more effective. And I think, broadly speaking, their philosophy of eat real food and don't mess around with it is the better one. Now, and then there's also an even deeper story we can get into as to like, what are these vitamins actually doing?
Well, yeah, and I think I read that part of your book is so fascinating. And then you talk about how the Italians use real butter and lardo, which is pork fat. And the average Italian, you said, weighs 170, average American 200, and 70% of women in this Italy, in the northern Italy region, are thin. 70%.
Yes.
That's definitely not true here.
No, it's nothing like it. And here's what's also interesting. We just talked about obesity, but there's different there's class 2 and class 3 obesity, which you're getting into what they call extreme obesity. I think in the United States, I think it's at 11% now. It barely even exists in Italy. So it's not just about this kind of rate of obesity. We are way, way better at producing body fat than they are. It can't even be compared. it's just such a stunning difference. And we have this hang up about food, and we talk about it being too delicious. And I think we're really getting it wrong.
So let's go into the deeper stuff. Like, first of all, when they add this niacin and all this other, how are they getting this? Where does this, because I've heard things where some of the vitamins are skimmed from sewage treatment plants. Is there any truth to that? Or how, or if not, like, how are they getting these vitamins? I don't understand
So
how.
that's a good question. And that's, I didn't actually look into that much. There is some question as to whether or not, these synthetically produced vitamins are as bioavailable as they are naturally in food. But what I got more interested in was what happens when your source of vitamin changes from different food products. I mean, the thought that occurred to me, and let's just state on the record that it sounds nuts to say that vitamins could play a role in obesity. Like, we've heard every theory in the world, and now to say vitamins, I mean, it seems crazy. But I got really curious about it because I thought, could there be some connection? And where the connection took hold for me, because my first book was about steak, and that got me really interested in how we raise animals. Because it's really interesting. There's all these different silos of science, and they never talk to each other. So, you have the human nutritionists and the psychologists basically saying, how can we get humans to eat less? Then you have the animal scientists saying, well, how can we get animals to eat more? Basically, what we've done with livestock is we've gotten them to get really big, really fat, really young. So the pigs and the chickens and the cows that we eat today are about half as old or way, way younger than they were half a century ago. We basically eat really fat adolescents.
And they
Um,
taste different, right? You talk about that, how like they didn't, like, people, older people, it doesn't taste like they remember it as a kid.
they have no flavor now. It's just basically full of water, and it's fatty and bland. There's just, I mean, as a result, we've had to crank up our recipes, and that's why we always want to fry stuff and put sauces on it, because it just doesn't have any flavor. And we should talk about that because that's also really interesting. But what I also know, when I did the steak book, there was this question of why would these cattle go into these feedlots and just eat corn, corn, corn? And there was some people said, oh, because there's not enough vitamins, so the cattle are kind of chasing the vitamins. And I mentioned that to a feedlot nutritionist. He said, no, that's wrong. He said, if they don't get their replete vitamins, especially particular ones, they will not gain the weight. It's basically overnutrition. It's not just about the fat and the carbs. It's about certain vitamins that they need. So I knew that there was this connection. And for years I was searching for it and I couldn't find it. And then finally the Google Scholar algorithm got sharp enough. And I found these studies that they did with pigs in the 1950s, basically when we start to make these discoveries about vitamins. Now, what's really interesting, if you look at pig farming prior to this, pastured pork is kind of trendy. You go to a store, pastured pork is more expensive. In the 1950s, all pork was pastured. They knew that you could get your pigs fat by feeding them corn and soy. But if that's all you fed them, they would get something like a pig version of Pellagra. Their hair would fall out, they'd get diarrhea, and then they'd die. So they knew that pigs needed to, quote, balance their diet by going out to pasture, where they'd often eat an awful lot of alfalfa. They didn't know why, but they basically knew that if pigs don't get their veggies, bad things happen. But then there was the discovery of vitamins, and you can see these studies where they give these pigs corn and soy, and they just start to dust in these B vitamins, and the weight gain and what they call feed efficiency, which is the ability to gain weight, pounds of gain versus pounds of feed, just gets better and better. And this is what changed farming. We talk about CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, confinement agriculture. This was all made possible by the discovery of vitamins, because it meant that you didn't need to send your pigs out to pasture anymore. It meant that the chickens didn't need to kind of go around the farm, eating bugs and little blades of grass and stuff like that. You could keep them confined and give them this kind of rocket fuel feed of carbs and the protein that they need, and you dust in the vitamins necessary to metabolize those calories, and weight gain takes off. And I found these pamphlets that were put out, I think it was the University of Ohio, maybe it was Illinois, my memory's failing me, but basically it was these guides they sent out to say, it would say things like, a pig has a reasonable ability to balance its diet, but there's a better way. And they would tell farmers how to, dust in these vitamins. And that's how they got optimal weight gain. And they never looked back. I mean, people might choose to eat pastured pork now, as I do, but it's not because it's cheaper. And those pigs are slower growing. They're more nutrient dense. They have way better flavor. but I mean, industry never looked back. Pigs were rousted off pasture. That's when we started creating these kind of, pig growing factories, essentially. And that was all enabled by vitamins. There's just a very simple way of looking at it. Calories, we think of calories as being energy. That doesn't quite get it. It's not like the same as, plugging something in the wall to get energy. Those calories are only energy if you have the micronutrients to metabolize them. And those micronutrients are the certain B vitamins. Niacin's a big one. So is thiamine. So is riboflavin. And so you look at the formula to get pigs to get big and fat really quickly is basically processed carbs plus B vitamins. Well, that's what we did. We said, let's start adding processed vitamins to our processed carbs. Kind of made sense at the time because a lot of, some people had pellagra, but in the long term, I think it was a terrible idea. And it's gotten worse because we've added more, like we've upped the amount of these vitamins that we add for enrichment policy. But the United States also has voluntary fortification, which means a company can just toss these vitamins in, and you see them in energy drinks, breakfast cereals, and they put them in because like some concerned mom looks at the ingredient panel and says, oh, look at all these vitamins. It must be healthy. So we've taken this formula that works to get animals big and fat quick, and we've done that to ourselves. And again, I think it captures this idea that something's wrong with food. We know better. We can fix it. And we don't know better. And we sure have not fixed it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and that's what I get in these arguments with people about processed food versus real food. And people are saying, because they'll say like, oh, you shouldn't eat meat. Meat is bad. You got to eat a little bit of meat. But I'm like, I mean, it seems like even if you look back in America, like when people were eating a lot of meat in the 50s and everybody was healthy and thin, and then now the processed food, people are eating so much. Like, I feel like probably a majority of most Americans' diet is processed food. And now we've got the obesity rates, chronic illness, heart disease, cancer, all that stuff's on the rise, and it's scary.
It's also processed meat is so much different than real meat. If you look at a steak versus like Spam, or it's just so incredibly different. And you see that in some of the literature that actual cuts of whole meat look very different than processed meat. And I agree. I think people want to beat up on meat, where I think people would be far better off drinking less soda and eating all that processed junk. That's really getting people into trouble.
Yeah, explain to my audience like the soda, because people think that the diet sodas are better because they're less calories, but this goes back to what you were saying before. Like, there's something with the artificial sweeteners that is, explain this, because I still don't know if I understand this even after reading your book, and I've been told this. It somehow it tricks your brain into wanting more or getting hungrier, or
Well, yeah, this is a long story. So one of the things I want to start with is that when we look at the neuroimaging of people with obesity, it tells an interesting story. Everybody thinks the problem is that people with obesity just indulge in pleasure too much. They lose themselves in the moment. And they just don't have the good sense to say enough. And that's not at all what the neuroimaging tells us. If you look at two brains, brain with obesity versus a trim brain, let's say you take a milkshake and you think of the sip of that milkshake, everyone thinks, well, the obese brain will be like this huge spike of pleasure or dopamine or whatever they call it. And that's not what we see. We do see a spike of dopamine, but it's upon what they say the receipt of the cue, which is say when they smell it or see it, they get this big spike of wanting. They're like, I really want to have that. The trim brain's like, oh, that looks nice. I'd like to have a sip of that. And then you see the sip, and the trim brain is like, oh, that was nice. I enjoyed that. Whereas the obese brain is like, the receipt of pleasure seems to be blunted. So then you ask this question, okay, there seems to be this problem of craving. It's not that people enjoy food too much, they want it too much. So what is it that could cause brains to want food? Like I said, to go on the hunt for quarter pounders and triple stackers and Big Macs and Whoppers. Let's talk about the brain, because it's important to ask, what does the brain do, and why do we have an appetite? And there's this idea that we were kind of wired in the Stone Age to just eat way too many calories because there was always this threat of famine. And I think that's wrong on the face of it. For one reason, if there's not enough calories going around, a really bad strategy is to overconsume calories because you end up getting fat. But here's the problem. Having a big body requires more calories. It's like driving a big truck versus a motorcycle. Like, you need way more gas just to drive it down the block. So a very big body just to maintain that body requires way more calories. So it's a bad strategy to just be on the prowl for calories if calories are scarce. Um, so you have to ask the question, what could cause this? Now, we have also a very rich sensory system. We have a sense of smell, a sense of taste. These combine to make this experience of flavor that we have. And we kind of think of it as this holdover from the Stone Age, like it's useless, it makes no sense. But it must be very important, because if you look at your DNA, the thickest chapter of your instruction manual to make you isn't like the chapter on the eyeballs or the brain or like the gonads. It's on your flavor sensing equipment. So it must be really important. So why does the brain sense food? Well, it's because eating is like a very difficult thing for the body to do. It's kind of like it's this big insult. It's like the body's operating. It's like, oh my God, this load of food comes into the stomach. It needs blood. We've got to start, sending this here, this over there. So the brain really likes to predict. We're not like an F-16 that can, like an F-16 can fuel in midair. We can't do that. You imagine trying to run an 800-meter race and eat a slice of pizza at the same time. It would be impossible. We can't do that. Fighter jets can. So what the brain really wants to do is be able to predict for a bunch of reasons. It wants to know what nutrients are coming, so it can get kind of an early start on sending them to where they need to go. And it also wants to be prepared. So that's why we have what we call sense of taste, sense of smell. And when you look at so much food technology, it ends up messing with these things. I wrote the Dorito effect because it's all about the flavor industry, where we can take the flavor of anything we want: oranges, tomatoes, apples, fried chicken, hot dogs, and we can impose that on anything. So that's one way we trick the brain. But sweetness is a really interesting one, because sweetness is basically a signal for calories. In nature, sweetness always means calories. If something's more sweet, it means more calories. If something's less sweet, it means fewer calories. Well, then we started coming up with artificial sweeteners. Now there's a whole bunch of them. And so now let's think of your brain's experience of sweetness. It used to be, for 99.9% of our existence, that's more sweetness equals more calories. Now, sweetness might mean calories, might mean no calories, might mean a whole bunch of calories, might mean just a few, because we've cut off this relationship, the predictability of sweetness. So now sweetness went from being predictable to being unpredictable. It causes what scientists call reward prediction error, which is basically, I thought I was getting something that I didn't get. And there's a huge body of psychological literature on this. It's called uncertainty. How does a brain respond to uncertainty? Very simply, it ramps up motivation. This is what evolution baked into us, is that if something important becomes uncertain, you might get it, you might not. You work harder to make sure you get it. A very good example is gambling. A gamble is just an invitation to uncertainty. You might win, the blackjack table, you might win, you might lose. Does that make you frightened? No, it makes you want to play. The double down sandwich is great. They borrowed this term right from gambling, because it's this enticement, this promise of riches. And that's what we did to so much of our food supply. There's the additives that knowingly mess with the senses, things like artificial flavors, artificial sweeteners, there's fat replacers. But then there's all sorts of things the processed food industry does, that things like emulsifiers and modified starches, that they have other roles. They don't want your sauce to separate in the jar, or they don't want to, if you microwave your pizza, you don't want like a little puddle forming. They have all sorts of reasons for designing these additives that may, let's say, have like modified starches. They have calories, they have no taste. So now your brain doesn't have the ability to sense them. So if you think of your sensory system as being there to predict what's coming in, it's just chaos now. Especially the more processed food you eat, the more chaotic it is. Whereas if you look at cultures that really value wholesome food, like Italy and Japan, there's not that same degree of chaos. I mean, they have some processed food. Italians drink some soda, like, a fifth as much as we do. They have some potato chips, but they don't eat nearly as much. They're far more enthralled to the pleasures of real food. And that food's not messing with their brain. It's not constantly giving them, different readings, and it's not unpredictable.
Yeah, that's interesting. You talk about the artificial sweeteners, and then I didn't realize this as much. There's also the artificial fatteners, or the fake fatteners, I think you called them in your book. Like, this cream fiber seven cream. What is it? Cream fiber 7,000 and
Yeah, cream
alginate.
fiber 7000. It's I think it's made from citrus fiber. It's designed for muffins. There's a huge industry of what they call fat replacers. And one of the reasons they're so big right now is because we have these ingredient panels and these you know those little things in the back that tell you how many calories there are, the nutrition panel. So people being calorie minded, they start to look at two packages and they say, well, one's got 190 calories, one's got 160. I'll go with the 160. So food manufacturers aren't dumb. They know what people are doing. So they're sitting there going, okay, how do we reduce the calories? So they'll put in artificial sweeteners, they'll put in fat replacers, and people have no idea. The thing that's weird and kind of troubling about fat replacers is that you have no idea if they're in there because artificial sweeteners, they appear in the ingredient panel, things like sucralose or ACE K. But fat replacers go by all sorts of strange names. I mean, carrageenan can be a fat replacer. Modified whey protein is one of them, which sounds like a cheese product or something. So it's really difficult to know that they're in there. The giveaway is often things like it might say light or diet, but they're putting these in all sorts of foods and not saying that. They just want to bring the calories down. So, you know, if you look at it over time, let's say from 1950s to now, every year that relationship between sensed calories and received calories gets blurry, more and more blurred.
Yeah. Well, and I think another good example that this is something that I've advocated for is eating real meat versus the fake meat. And I think it was even in, was it Food Incorporated too? I think that was the one that you were in where they're showing like, look, we're making this fake meat. And they're like, well, what is this thing that's like, it's like a part of a fiber. It's like, well, what is that? Like we take it off of a tree and we grind it up and it's ground up tree that's in a burger. I mean, that's got to be messing with your digestive system and your brain and your whole everything, right?
Well, it's also what's interesting too is they call these foods plant-based, but they get rid of everything that makes plants healthy. They get rid of the fiber, they get rid of the plant compounds. I mean, you know, Doritos and Coca-Cola, they're also plant-based. They don't come from animals. So
Right.
it's there's a lot of weird things about that. I think in general, you know, maybe one day our understanding of food and our technology will be so good that we can create simulations of food that are authentic, but I don't think we're capable of doing it. I think maybe the intentions are good. I think a lot of people are just after, you know, they want to become billionaires, but I don't think we can do it.
Yeah. I mean, geez, listening to your books, honestly, like I had to like turn them off at night because it's kind of like a horror movie. Like it really is like scary. All this shit is in our food. And especially I think because of the processed food, it's like, okay, that's easy. Like, you know, just look at the ingredients on your food. If it's got a bunch of ingredients that's processed, don't get, you know, just buy like regular food. But even like meats, like a chicken, you talk about how the chicken has changed, which we've kind of talked about a little bit over the years. And so it's just like I go, and the fruits and vegetables are different now. It's like, I don't know. So like, how do we get out of this mess that we're in?
It's a really good question, and it's not easy. I think, you know, everything you do as a consumer sends a message to industry. You know, one of the reasons chicken got so messed up, everybody wants to blame the big chicken companies, and I'm not saying they're completely not at fault, but every time people buy chicken on sale or they say they want boneless chicken breast, they're sending a message to the chicken companies, but also the genetics companies, the companies that design chickens to say, well, we want more breast meat. So you end up getting these chickens that grow super fast and have these super big, you know, breast muscles that have no flavor. And it's nobody really wants this. No one's saying that's what they actually want, but it's sort of the perversions of the market. So as a consumer, everything you do has an effect, sends a signal. Now, I think as troubling as things are, there are good news stories. I think an example I often use is craft beer. It's incredibly successful. There tends to be way more margin. That's where all the talk is, certainly. And this is a trend in beer. If you went back, I mean, to, you know, the terrible days, the bad old 1980s when everybody was drinking Bud Light and Michelob and Coors Light, which are kind of indistinguishable. Nobody could have imagined, you know, 40 years from now, people are going to be drinking these like IPAs and porters and stouts. And this was driven largely by a desire for more flavor, to the point that people have a much deeper understanding of the beer that they drink. They know the different styles. They might even know the person who made it. So I think that's a good news story. I think as bad as some of the meat is, grass-fed beef is, a much larger chunk of the industry now than it was when I wrote my book about steak. So I think there's also things are going in positive directions as well. I know that some of the berry companies are starting to care about flavor, which is important because strawberries I think are better now than they were 5 years ago. You remember when they used to be like the size of a fist and just like wet cardboard. They're starting to get better. They got a long way to go. But I think things can improve. I see things kind of taking two, like some foods getting worse and worse, and some actually is starting to get moderately better.
Well, and didn't you say too that like tomatoes, for example, like if you take a bite of a tomato, it should just like be amazing because and also that taste is signaling all the nutrients in there. And then so when a tomato tastes bland, that's a bad sign that it's lacking nutrients.
Yeah, that comes from research at the University of Florida, and a guy named Harry Klee really devoted his scientific career to trying to make tomatoes taste better. It started. He was hired by Monsanto to create a genetically modified tomato that just took longer to ripen, so they could pick it when it was kind of getting to be red, and then it would last long enough. And they found out that didn't work. It wasn't a ripening problem. It was something much deeper. And essentially, for like a century, we've been choosing tomatoes based on how many, yield. Do we get a lot of tomatoes? Are they disease resistant? Do they have a thick skin? Will they last in store shelves? Nobody ever looks at flavor. So if you're breeding tomatoes and you don't select for flavor, you're going to lose it. It's reverse evolutionary pressure. If you don't select a trait, that trait will go away. And that's what we did with tomatoes. But what Harry Klee found is when he looked at it, he wanted to understand, how do tomatoes make flavor? Because he thought if he could understand that the enzymatic process, he could start to target for it in his breeding. And he found that there's about 26 flavor compounds in tomatoes that just make that tomato sing, that make you go like, wow, that tomato is awesome. And when he looked at how the tomato synthesizes those flavor compounds, each one is synthesized from an essential nutrient, like from an omega-3 or from a carotenoid, which we use to make vitamin A. So if you understand how the tomato makes flavor, what you realize is that the flavor is a big sign to your brain saying, I'm filled with nutrition. So when you bite into that tomato and you go, oh my God, that's awesome, it's because it is awesome. It is really good for you. And that's another case of where we've broken this connection between what we sense and what we get. So I think one of the major problems is we think we're these brilliant nutritionists and we talk about protein and calories and carbs and fat. But the truth is, what we're really in for, what evolution designed us for, was flavor, was the true robust enjoyment of food, because that's how the brain was designed to find and get nutrients. And that's the connection we've broken. So we're not going to get through this by looking at ingredient panels and talking about carbs and protein. We have no clue about that stuff. It's this relationship we have with real food, is that it speaks to us on an elemental level.
Yeah. Do you think that like these people, because I've had a lot of the keto diet people on my show, and that, they really promote the keto diet and carnivore diet, and the people that do those diets seem to have very good results. Like, or do you think that that's maybe too extreme, that even just eating whole foods would suffice, and maybe even being able to throw in some carbs and some bread if it's done right?
I think so. If those diets are working for them, I don't want to say they're wrong or anything. If it works for them and they're happy, that's great. But I do think it's possible, and I would suggest, yeah, eating a balanced diet, whole foods. I think there's a reason fruit is delicious, because our ancestors lived in jungles and ate a lot of fruit. There's an awful lot of nutrition in fruit. If you look at the flavor industry, the most popular flavor family is the citrus family. Citrus fruit is really healthy. I think you can eat bread, but there's a huge difference between, let's say, a sourdough multigrain and kind of factory produced breads that you find in the stores. I think if you eat whole foods, the products of the land and the sea, you'll do just fine.
Yeah. What is it? I mean, I also think a big part of this is just acknowledging that, that these flavor companies, or whatever you want to call it, the food companies, they make some amazing products. Like, I mean, cherry Sour Patch Kids, like those are amazing. Like, I don't know if there's anything in nature that mimics that. It is like an amazing thing that tastes great. And so I see why people are eating, so much of it, but it's almost like you said in the book, You've got to build a wall between your thinking self and your pleasure self.
I also think these foods seem to be more appealing to children and teenagers, where I think the palate is a little bit less developed. Because I think, I used to drink a lot of Coke, like not crazy amounts, but like in most teenagers, I drank a lot of it. I don't drink it really anymore. And if I drink it now, the first sip is kind of like, oh yeah, that's good. I remember Coke. And then by the fourth sip, I'm like, I'm done. It's syrupy. It's gross. I don't want it. So I do think your palate can change. And I think there's kind of a cartoonish quality to a lot of these foods. It's kind of low hanging fruit, excuse the metaphor. They're not really, I don't want to use words like sophisticated to make it sound elevated or snobbish or something, but they're just not that interesting. They're kind of cheap thrills, right?
Yeah. What are some really amazing meals that you've had? What does that consist of?
Well, obviously, I wrote a book about steak, so I really do love steak. But I love all the meats. I love heirloom chickens. Just they don't actually have to be fully heirloom. They just slower growing chickens that get access to pasture. They have such a wonderful flavor. Like the way they used to make fried chicken, it wasn't deep fried. They would take what was a fryer, which was to say about a 12 or 14-year old, a week old bird, and these were much slower growing. So they're really only like 2.5 or 3 pounds at that point. These were usually the males before they start to become sexually mature and start to harass the kiln. And that's what you'd get. That was the fried chicken you get like on these railroad cars in the 1930s. And what they would do is they would put salt and pepper on them and dredge them in flour and then shallow fry them and then pour a little bit of water in the pan and put a lid on it and let it steam for like 20 minutes and then take the lid off and then fry it again. And you don't get this crunchy surface. I don't even know how to describe the texture, but it like the flavor is just incredible. It is, and it's delicious in a different way. Like I don't even know how to describe it. I remember when I was researching the Dorito effect, and I talked to this guy who's this heirloom chicken enthusiast, and he said it makes your tummy happy. And I thought, like, what are you talking about? That sounds so silly. And I was like, you're right. It like nourishes the soul. This food is so delicious. I love pastured pork. I love fruit. I mean, summer right now, I'm eating peaches. I'm eating nectarines. A friend of mine has a farm. He's got this incredibly huge raspberry patch. His plum trees are about to, come into fruit. It's what a great time of year. And yet I also love, I know, grains are a bad word, but I love pasta. Now, Italian pasta is very different than the pasta that we eat. The portions are smaller. Fresh pasta it just has this incredible texture. It's so incredibly delicious, but also satisfying. Um, yeah, and there's just, I mean, we're so lucky. We live in an era where we have all these cuisines we have access to: Korean cuisine, Japanese cuisine, Indian cuisine, Indonesian cuisine. These gifts from our forebears, these people that figured out all these amazing flavor combinations, which are often very good nutritional combinations as well. These people figured out how to nourish themselves, and that's what they've handed down. Recipes are tricks to making food taste good, but also tricks to making food healthy and delicious.
Well, yeah, and then there's something about too that you talk about that makes sense to me is that when you eat, like what you said, the heirloom chicken, like you feel good afterwards. Whereas like a lot of this processed food or junk food, like you'll eat it and then afterwards you're like, oh God, why did I do that? Like you just feel
No,
like so
totally.
bloated and
Bloated and you get that headache and you get that regret. And people joke about it. They talk about the food hangover. And I'm like, no, no, no. Like, A, that's like an inflammation response. Like your body's telling you that was bad. But B, food is not supposed to make you feel bad. It should make you feel good. That was one of the revelations I had when I wrote my steak book, was that I'd get one of these really fatty, like feedlot steaks, and I just feel wretched afterwards. Like you got to lie down. You feel like you overdid it. You eat a really, really good grass-fed steak, and there's a lot of bad grass-fed beef out there. It's hard to do it well, but when it's done well, you eat that steak, and it's like eating sushi. Like you rise up out of your chair, you've got energy, you feel good. You could go for a walk. Food is supposed to make you feel good.
yeah. With the food additives and the flavors, and you talk about in the book about natural versus artificial, but what are we really eating? I mean, do we even know what some of this stuff where it comes from? Like, because they're picking things from a lab and splicing them together. Like, do we even know what it is really in these flavors?
No, it's interesting because the natural flavors, a lot, the reason there's been this big move in the industry to go with natural flavors is because the word natural soothes people and the word artificial frightens them. But the only difference, these are very often the very same compounds. Often the artificial ones are more pure. The natural ones are made with things like distillation and evaporation, and whereas artificial ones are, very advanced chemical processes. Um, so the principle that they use these is called generally regarded as safe. And that's often because, they'll find it in nature, so they think that makes it okay. And I'm not saying these things are necessarily bad, but I think that the truth is we're kind of going down this highway blindfolded. There's just so much of this stuff being added all the time that I don't think we know what the effects are. But when we step back and we look at, there is this relationship between eating ultra-processed foods and all sorts of negative health outcomes. And I think on the very simplest level, that's saying, okay, maybe don't eat so much of this stuff.
Yeah, and also maybe it's like you said, like nature got it right the first. Like we can't mess with nature. Nature's got this food that goes together. Like I think I remember reading at one point one of these food dyes. I don't know if this was right. I think it was a red food dye, was made of ground up cockroaches or something, or some sort of bug that had that color that was like this red. And so we don't know the effects of eating massive amounts of this bug or whatever, or the piece of the bug shell or whatever it is. Like it's probably not good.
Well, I would put it this way: we're often afraid of chemicals, but the most interesting difference to me between natural, real food that's a product of nature versus manufactured food, is there's way more chemicals in nature. If you look at the number of chemicals in a strawberry, it's in the tens of thousands. So even though we get worried by these ingredient lists that sound weird, and we should, chemically speaking, there's a total lack of diversity. Humans are great simplifiers. We'll create a strawberry flavoring that will have 8, 10 compounds in it. That's nothing like the incredible diversity you get in a strawberry. So we just kind of simplify things and make this cartoon version. And I don't think that's the food that we were designed to eat. I think in the moment it can taste okay, but I think as far as a sustainable diet, a way of eating it, I don't think it tastes great, and B, I don't think it's good for us.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I just feel like the food that was put here naturally was done that for it was done for a reason, and then we're trying to mess with it, and I just don't think. Yeah, you're right. Maybe someday we'll figure it out, but right now we have not, and for whatever reason, it's making us obese and causing disease and sickness. And I mean, do you think that is a piece of the heart disease thing? Because I know meat gets blamed for heart disease and butter, but again, we go back to those Italians eating the butter and pork fat, and they're not obese.
I think obesity is the big one to be worried about these days, and I think ultra processed foods. It's these highly confected products that are more concerning. Is there, the data on, let's say, saturated fat and LDL cholesterol? I think there is something there. But the truth is, I think if you eat a really well-rounded diet, which also includes things like olive oil, that's kind of naturally going to go down. You're not going to just eat butter and lard and steak all the time. You're going to be eating fish, you're going to be eating vegetables, you're going to be eating chicken. So again, I think if you kind of worship at the throne of nature, it'll kind of balance things out in its own way.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think with the exercise, I feel like is a piece of it too. But then I see so many people that it's just like they just eat healthy and they're in great shape. And I don't think they're working out a lot either. And I feel like I'm working out twice a day and I'm still struggling to lose the extra 5 or 10 pounds around my gut.
Yeah, there's a deep part of your brain that's in charge of that stuff, and it's got a mind of its own.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the books they're both out now, right? Yeah.
Yep, there's 3. There's steak, there's
I
the
haven't read the
Dorito,
steak
and
one.
there's
Yeah,
the end
I'm
of
curious about
craving.
that. I'll have to check that out because I do love steak.
Yeah, no, that was my first book. That came out quite a while ago, but that was a great adventure.
And then do you have a fourth one coming or?
Nothing that works yet, but at some point there'll probably be something.
Yeah, I mean, this is just like your main thing is food. You're not gonna write a novel or something like that. Just switch
I
it
don't
up.
think so. No, I'm very interested in food. So
Yeah, I mean, is there anything else in terms of solutions that you think that, like you said, maybe just we vote with our dollar. So if we start buying these more high quality foods, if people can afford it, maybe that will help.
I think so, and I think also it takes time, but I think you can kind of rewire your taste buds. In the sense that once you start to get away from some of these foods, they lose their hold over you. But it's also, the brain is very powerful, and like you saying, you struggle to lose that extra 5 or 10 pounds. It can be really difficult. It's That's why it's not so easy to, it'd be far better if we never got to this way in the first place.
Right? I know. It's like, well, that was one of the things like that. One of the last things, big changes that I made is like, I was like, I got to cut out diet soda. Like, I'm not trusting this. Like, I know it says 0 calories, but I'm not buying it. So I started doing iced teas, and I feel like that is a little bit better. Do you have something that is, you cut out soda? Do you do iced tea or coffee, or what do you, just water?
I love coffee. Funnily enough, I used to put sugar in my coffee, and at some point, I was like, what am I doing? Like, and I just kind of voluntarily stopped. Um, I like water. I think often if you want something with a little bit, just put a little squeeze of lime or lemon in water, and it just gives it that something. It just has a little bit more presence on the tongue, and it's more enjoyable.
What do you think about these natural sweeteners like monk fruit and stevia? Is that pretty much just a version
It's
of?
just the same thing. It's not a question of where it came from. Something's not evil because it came from a lab, and wonderful because it came from a plant. There's a lot of plants out there that want to kill you. They're filled with poisons. I'm not saying stevia is a poison, but just because it came from a plant doesn't mean it's okay. I think it's just the question of, if you believe that the sweet signal is a nutritional signal, then you can't really get around that. So I don't think, everybody wants to say it came from a fruit or a leaf, it's okay. I don't think so. I think we're also just better off. I think people have too much of a sweet palate. Once you get away from that stuff, I'm often amazed at like a lot of recipes, just cut the sugar. Like, use 75 or 60% of the sugar they call for. A lot of sweets are just so sweet. They're too sweet. They're kind of gross.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Melissa Urban. She wrote that book, The Whole 30, and I think that's a good like start if people really want to like. I mean, it's hard to do that for 30 days to cut out and just eat whole foods, but she talks about how when people cut out all these like sweeteners and soda and all this stuff, and then it's like you actually eat a piece of fruit, you can really taste how good a piece of fruit is without having to because you're not just loading it up on sugar or whatever.
Yeah, it's true. It's definitely true.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. And again, the books are out now. I'll put the link in the show notes. Anything else you want to promote?
No, it's been a great chat. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Feel free to come back for when you have your next book to promote.
That sounds great. I love you.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Take care.
See ya.